listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I'm your host, Ange, and welcome you to episode number 20. Today, we welcome Scott Lynch, host of the Motivated Mind podcast. Scott's podcast was the inspiration for me to kick off this podcast, and so this episode is very special for me. As the host of the Spotify Top 100 Health and Fitness podcast, The Motivated Mind, with over 4.6 million downloads, listeners in 232 countries, and close to 140,000 followers, Scott challenges you to expand your perspective on how to achieve a successful life through motivational lessons, reflections, and interviews with other motivated minds. From concepts based in philosophy and psychology to energizing lessons in mindset and lifestyle hacks, personal growth and process, entrepreneurship, business, and mindfulness, Scott utilizes research-backed frameworks and personal experiments to guide you to more heavily invest in your own happiness and personal success. This episode does include sensitive topics, including the mention of suicide. If you feel it may be triggering to you, then we encourage you to listen to the episode in a therapeutic community to ensure you are safe and supported. So, what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee and let's get started. Good afternoon, listeners. I'm very excited today to have Scott Lynch, the host of the Motivated Mind podcast here. And I just believe in being transparent. So I'm going to tell the audience, first off, I'm not afraid of public speaking. I rarely get nervous. This is the only podcast episode I'm a little nervous about. And here is why. People say, Ange, why did you guys start a podcast for your nonprofit? And originally, Recovery Advocate Network, we were doing webinars because the spirit of the nonprofit is one of the arms is education, reducing the stigma. So we were doing that via webinars. Webinars are a significant challenge to set up and run. And so at the beginning of the year, my psychiatrist started referring me to podcasts. I'm a big follower of Andrew Huberman's podcast and the Huberman Lab podcast. Yes. Yep. And somewhere along the journey, I came across the Motivated Mind podcast and fell in love with it. In fact, I've back then referred at the beginning of this year, your podcast to a lot of friends. And suddenly one day I said, wait, we should not do webinars. It would, I was naive at the time. I said, it'll be so much easier to do a podcast because I loved the ability to get the information out into the general public and have one-on-one conversations and that based on what you had built. And so I am nervous because you are like my idol and really the reason that started off the podcast series. So first off, thank you for saying yes and agreeing to be on this podcast and being here. And now I'm going to just do my classic stop talking for a minute and ask you, Scott, please introduce yourself and give us a little insight into why you're here today.
Yeah. So first off, flattered. Thank you very much. And thank you for the referrals. I always say it's a privilege to have listeners listen to your ideas, your stories, your formulas. It's not every day that you get that opportunity. So the fact that people listen, the fact that people refer is just, it's amazing. My journey starts back in 2015. So I've had this podcast since 2018, but 2015 is really where I would say my life took a completely different trajectory than I could have ever imagined. It was December 27th, so not too long after Christmas. I remember being in my home in my bedroom and my phone vibrating, a text from one of my best friends who had said, Tim, my best friend, had been shot. And of course, receiving a text message like that, our brain naturally goes to worst case scenario. We're all great at that. We're experts at worst case scenario. And I tried to pause myself in that moment to say, hold on a minute. He's an avid outdoorsman. Maybe he had an accidental discharge and shot himself in the arm or leg. It was 5 or 10 minutes that had gone by that I was waiting for a response to that question, which felt like eternity, right? It felt like hours. And eventually that friend had texted me and said, no, Tim has taken his own life. And in that moment, everything shifted. Just a wave. It was like someone had opened up a dam, and that dam cascaded and covered everything. Emotions, judgment, perspective. I mean, you name it. It was just all flowing out at the same time. And that was the darkest point I think I have ever been in my life. To understand, or to try to understand, how could someone be here one moment and then gone the next? And then the next wave that followed that, which is really what started my trajectory into the mental health space in podcasting, was this victim mentality that I had played. The immediate, why was I not there? How did I not see his pain? Why didn't I spend more time with him? Why didn't I do more? All of these attacks on myself after my mind and body had just been attacked by a traumatic situation. I reverted, or immediately went to attacking myself with those things. And of course, in that moment, I did not realize all this. I'm saying this now after many years of going to therapy and understanding what did that situation mean to me. And I realized that I wanted to take the darkest moment in my life and squeeze it, wring it like a wet towel, and extract some sort of light out of it as much as I could. And the first part of that was light for myself, to find what this meant to me. How could I translate this into something powerful, something good, and not play this victim mentality with myself about the situation? How could I help create a legacy for him and myself around such a dark moment? And so in October of 2018, I think it was at this point, it feels like so long ago, I started the podcast with the mission to help shed light in darkness for people, to help other people elevate in their life, to understand that they are worthy, that they are loved, and an equal value, that they can actually control everything in their life. Everything in their life. And I've given many formulas and tactics and hacks, whatever you want to call them, to help people get through that darkness. And so that was really the backstory and inspiration behind the podcast. And since then, we've hit 4.6 million downloads. We're getting close to 5 million at this point. We bounce between top 200, top 100 mental health podcasts. I have listeners in 170 different countries or something like that. And the DMs that I get, they give me goosebumps thinking about them, reading them, and realizing, wow, we individually can make an impact on thousands of people's lives by talking into a mic.
So I've mentioned your podcast in several of my episodes because I've used several of the tools that I've learned in your podcast, such as episode 11 is on AI and the use of AI in mental health, my episode 11. And I talked about the AI app that you had recommended on one of your episodes. I now have my company using Asana. You mentioned it in one of your tools of efficiency.
It's my spine.
Yes, I love it. Yeah, it was so funny. Yesterday in a meeting, one of my new employees said, I love Asana. I said, that's great, because I do too. Listening to the stats you just gave, one of the phrases you repeatedly say in your podcast, and it really helped me early on when I was kicking off this podcast, because when I started listening to yours, I started listening to episodes that were somewhere in the 300s. Then I started researching, how do I start a podcast? Thankfully, I have a friend that has another podcast. It's around 100 episodes. He helps me with some of the logistics. Listening to yours, I was trying to record, and I was in that, you're in chapter 10 and I'm in chapter 1. So that's one of the things you repeat over and over. Don't compare your chapter 1 to your chapter 1 to your chapter 10. So I want to say to our listeners and the people on this team, we are celebrating our chapter 1, the episode I'm releasing. So we're recording this right now on Friday, the 22nd of September. It's not going to be released today. It's going to be released in the future. The episode we're releasing tomorrow on the 23rd, I highlight at the end of it that we now have 13 countries that we have listeners in.
Woohoo!
And I'm going to celebrate that. It's not 100 and something. It's amazing. Much to the fact that I get giddy that there is a listener in Kenya, and our 2 new countries are Czech Republic and Ireland. And much the same thing, right? If there's one more individual that listens to perhaps an episode on boundaries, or the link between childhood trauma and addiction, or how to change their mindset so they're going into the day with a mindset that's going to help them towards productivity, healthy collaboration, those types of things, it's just like a gift and amazing. And I also, it's allowing me to give myself grace, because I listen to some of my episodes and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm still trying to figure out microphone settings and things like that. And I said to a friend the other day, I said, I'm just going to have to, I don't love the way it sounds. I'm going to publish it, because it just has to get out there and move on. So I want to say to you, so I know in listening to your episodes and following you, you went through a period where you were releasing a certain number, and then you had to, or you got to, you don't have to do anything. You got to increase to at least 2 per week, which for me, I do this on the side. I'm CEO of a biopharmaceutical company during the week. So I do that, and I do this on the side. And I recently am at the stage where, wow, if I had someone assisting me editing, I would love to be able to release 2 per week, because I'm adding up too many in reserves, right? And so for you, when you made that transition to 2 per week, a little bit, what was the impetus of that? What were some of the challenges and maybe the benefits that you saw from it?
So, great question and great observation. So I think it's been 2.5 years that I switched from going to 1 to 2. So much work. First off, like a lot of work. So to give some context, for an average, I don't bring a ton of guests on, but I drop between 2 and 3 guests a month. Most of my episodes are around specific things, right? How to master your mindset, how to create boundaries, some of the stuff you were just talking about, so many similarities between what we're doing, and I love it. For those episodes, which are a majority of my episodes, I write roughly from anywhere from 8 to 11 pages of a script, because I am a fanatic about metaphors and really getting deep into some of the nitty gritty and stuff, and being unique, having my own voice pull through, my authenticity. And that takes a lot of work. That takes me between 4 and 5 hours of prep just to write. And there's obviously research involved, because I don't have all the knowledge in the world at the top of my head for other things that most of the stuff I implement. So it's easier, quote unquote, to describe and write about some of these things, because a lot of things that I preach, I practice. So that's a context on work. What was the reason that I did it? So everybody listening has probably heard this idea of like, just get 1% better. There's a remarkable book I shouted out a lot on my podcast called Atomic Habits my favorite book in the world. Everybody should read that book. It's remarkable about habit mastery and how to break bad habits. The idea of compounding is something that is a struggle for many of us to comprehend what 8% compounding means year over year, right? Stock market, right? Well, the same thing can be said for our own world. So I asked myself, what if I got 1% better? And technically this isn't 1% better because I doubled up what I was doing for an episode, but bear with me for a moment. And I asked myself, would that be my breaking point? Can I actually do more? It was just about leaning into curiosity and my capabilities. And so I'll give you a great story behind this. My first home that I bought was a fixer-upper, to say the very least. I pulled 5.6 tons of material, and I know that number specifically because they measure the dumpsters when they pull it out to charge you for the amount of material that you pulled out. And I was going to the office. I was in my apartment, driving to the office, coming back at the end of the day, getting some food in my mouth, feeding my dog, driving up an hour north to this house and working on it until 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning. Now, I'm way too good about my sleep now, but this was very young Scott. And I remember for 3 years, I remodeled that house on the side. I was extremely, as I am today, disciplined about limiting hanging out with friends, etc., because I had a goal. I wanted to actually flip this house. But one day I made the decision that there was a date, and I set that date and I stuck to that date and said, this is the date that I'm going to sell this house. Now, the dining room floors were this wood that were extremely tough to sand down. And I rented one of those big floor sanders from the Home Depot or Lowe's. And that sander kept on ripping through the belt or the sandpaper. And it was at the end of summer. It was so hot. I was sweating and I just felt defeated. I remember my back hitting the wall and sliding down the wall with like my sweat stain following my body down to the ground. And I said, I think I just found my breaking point. I found my edge physically and emotionally. I was drained. I was managing 2 companies while trying to flip a house. It just was a lot, and relationships too at the same time. And I love this idea of questioning our current capabilities, not for the idea of torture, but the idea of, well, these thoughts that we have or our limitations or any of these different things, is there an edge? And if there's an edge, when did I define this edge, right? And who defined it? And so the idea of jumping to 2 episodes was to see if I could actually do it. And the other reason was that my mission, right, to help other people, to create this legacy for the incident with my friend, his suicide. And that drove beyond any drainage emotionally or physically. And that was really the driver behind going to 2 episodes a week.
Makes complete sense. And I know you talk in some of your episodes about just analyzing what you do during your day and how much time is wasted on silly things.
Yes.
And I can relate to so much of what you're saying now. And people have said to me, how do you accomplish all the things that you accomplish? Like, and I think I try and sit and think, well, I don't waste time doing a lot of the things that other people talk about doing. I am very thoughtful about the things that I do and what's the outcome of them going to be. And is that outcome aligned with what my life goals and what my life missions are? And when I started this first off, when I started this podcast, I thought I was doing it because it was going to be easier and less time consuming. I was wrong.
Yep.
10,000% wrong. For anyone who thinks I don't know how to say when I'm wrong, please, record this. And so you can listen to it a gazillion times ever. I was so wrong. And yet at the same time, I had some unexpected gifts that came out of doing the podcast. I really did not expect for it to be a healthy balance for me for the stress that I have being a COO of a company and going in and having the stress of trying to hire and having to terminate employees and transitions and running clinical trials and board meetings and all of that kind of stuff, to then completely shift to, okay, now I get to be a podcast host, and I get to get text messages from people who say, wow, I didn't know I could say no like this. I didn't know I could set a boundary like this and it was okay. Or this episode on healing from sexual trauma completely touched my life. And that amount of feeling as if I had an outlet that was making an immediate impact to individuals that I've never met in my life, really, it was a lot of work, but a good balance in that way. It was amazing. Now, with that said, I suddenly at this point also had conversations with my therapist, actually, where first off, he listens to all the episodes. So then he critiques later. He's just like,
I love it.
You talk a lot about your mom in your episodes. Why don't you ever talk about your dad, for example?
Yeah.
I laugh. And he's like, I'm at this point in this episode, so it's kind of funny.
That's
but,
great.
But one of the unintended, I shall say, consequences of being a host, I was just recently interviewing the author of the book, Backpack to Rucksack. So that episode will come out before this one. And he and I were talking about some unintended challenges with being the voice of others. So in his book, it's a military organizational leadership book, but he also talks about mental health in the military environment. He talks about speaking up against suicide and suicide prevention and mental health specifically when individuals come back and return to their families. And then I said, one of the things I wasn't expecting is that some of the stories on my podcast are incredibly emotional. And when you're editing a podcast takes 4 to 5 hours at minimum. And so I'll listen to it. And then some of them I have to just stop and come back to it. And that emotional component of it is really, really intense. And so he and I talked about that. Dan and I talked about that on his episode. And I would love to hear from you as you've transpired over these past 5 years. And I can tell listening to your podcast, I can actually give you kudos. I can tell maybe some emotional growth in you listening to the way that your first early episodes are and now how they are. So can you maybe share that emotional impact that you've had? Maybe if you've had a particular podcast episode you can think of that was particularly challenging, that had an emotional impact or something of that nature.
So this is a great subject, and thank you for the recognition. I call it Cringe Mountain. When I go back to my first episodes, I'm like, oh boy. But listen, that's life, right? You've got to start somewhere. I would say that most of the emotional ride comes from the messages that I receive from individuals that listen to the podcast. There are a lot of emotional episodes and stories that people discuss that I'm grateful that they get that deep and vulnerable with me and that they feel safe to express themselves in that environment. But mostly there's one DM that I will never forget, and it was a nurse during COVID, and she was exhausted, obviously, during COVID. The amount of work, the hours that she was working. And she reached out to me, which must have took a lot of strength just to reach out, that a lot of her friends were saying, you need to speak to someone, you need to talk to someone, you need to do something because we can tell that it's affecting your mental health. She was on the phone one day going to work with her mother, and being a nurse, she could tell she was about to pass out while driving. And immediately proceeding through an intersection, she went down an alley and hit a building head on because she had passed out with her mom on the phone. And she took a lot of time off of work after that incident, and she found my podcast. And she had been listening to it for, I think I have screenshots of her DM that I asked if I could share on my Instagram if you go far enough back. And she had said how much that the podcast had impacted her life and her health and her relationships in a relationship with work and her parents. And it gives me goosebumps thinking about that, the impact that we were talking about. And in all honesty, as I try to be in every situation, it brought tears reading this story. And it specifically brought tears because, and other DMs that I've received, to know that there are people in that much pain and suffering. And they feel alone. That, to me, gets me the first experience is sad. The second wave of that is angry because I want to change it for them. And the third and final piece that comes out of the machine is, well, what can I do about it? And so that's really how I've taken all of these emotional stories that I've heard, whether it be a guest or whether it be a DM, is again reverting back to ground zero with myself. A dark moment. How do I change this into something powerful? And so I've been able to get through these stories and the privilege of being part of them by leveraging them for fuel to keep going. So on those days when I'm exhausted, we had our first child, she's 7 months old, and, I got 3 companies that I run. It's a lot. But at the end of the day, I'm doing this for a reason, and that reason is bigger than me. So it's irrelevant of how much I'm feeling in that moment. Back to your point, it's therapeutic what I do. There's a lot of power in being selfish, right? It turns into selflessness. Selfishly, I want to do the podcast because it's healing for me. It keeps me on the track of focusing on positivity, focusing on the things that I control, focusing on managing my time, focusing on opportunity, focus on helping other people. And that is selfish, but it is very selfless on the outcome, the output of that input. And so I think when you start to take things like that and manipulate them in a healthy way, it provides an endless source of fuel for each of us on our missions to whatever extent and whatever subject that may be.
I can completely relate. I was thinking recently also I had 1 week, a couple of weeks ago, when I was talking to my therapist about this, and I just hit like a slump 1 week where I was feeling suddenly really depressed for no reason that I could think of. And it suddenly occurred to me that the week before we had some huge successes and individuals saying yes to be guests on the podcast and some huge, just a lot of successes in the podcast. And I said to my therapist, and I think it's good that I had read Anna Lemke's Dopamine Nation and have listened to a lot of Andrew Huberman's episodes on that I said, what I think is that the natural high dopamine hit from feeling like these episodes, these voices, and the individuals who are so happy that they get an opportunity to share their story and all of that was having this impact on my body and my reactions that I didn't even realize. And so it's also caused me to have to think, okay, I need to be thoughtful and strategic on how to manage and balance this. And I think the beauty of recognizing that and experiencing it, and especially being a leader in my company, is I've had an opportunity since then to talk to one of my employees who, for a completely different situation, was experiencing something similar. And I said, oh, wait, I just recently experienced this in a very different way. And this is kind of where I tied it to. And so it's kind of understanding that overload, and yes, the blessing and the taxing of the blessing and those components of it. But one of the things that Dan and I were talking about is just the ability to, I almost feel as if a little bit of an obligation, if you have a voice and you're willing to provide the voice for other individuals, then to use that skill to provide that voice. So I just give kudos to you. Now, a challenge that I think of for you. So in my situation, I will say that Christina on my team has done a lot as far as reaching out to authors. So the episode I'm releasing tomorrow, I start the episode by telling her I got her book in the mail. And so if I'm interviewing an author for our book club series, I read every single book before I interview the author. And so now I feel as if I'm in college, because the other day I got a pack of books from my head of fundraising. And I was just like, oh, these are books that I did not select that I wanted to read. And one of them, the one that's being released tomorrow, is Making Friends with Monsters. And it's a young adult book. And I was like, oh my gosh, I do not want to read this book. Why do I have to read this book? The book is amazing. Absolutely amazing. And yet, so I will say that one of the scenarios is some of these episodes are being handed to me, like, you have to read this book and then this is what you're going to do. Now, in your scenario, I was thinking about this the other day because I thought Scott does so many of his where you have to think, what's the next thing that's missing out in the world? What's a new voice, or what's how do you come up with your ideas? What's your inspiration? How do you find the area of need?
I love this. So I have a backlog of 145 episodes, and I schedule all of them. I'm so organized, as you could probably guess from all my episodes, and a very structured human being. And I have 145 backlogged episodes, and you should see my notes app. I actually dropped an episode on how I organize all my notes on my phone, but we have all these in a spreadsheet. The inspiration comes from, number one, DMs. When I see a commonality between a thread that I'm hearing a lot about, people asking very similar questions. So I go to that sheet or my note app, depending where I'm at that point, if I have my computer or my cell phone in front of me. And so most of them come from the audience. So I always have an ask at the beginning, a couple of asks, but one of them is to send me a DM. Let me know what you want to hear more of. And now it doesn't come out in I would love for you to do an episode about X or Y. It's normally, hey, Scott, listen to your podcast. Love it. Here's how it's helped me. Here's something I'm dealing with. Do you think you could provide any insight or any support? Or point me if you've done an episode on this. And so I jot all of those ideas down on, again, my notes app or my sheet. And then those start to translate into episodes. And many of them are things that we all end up running into every single day, right? Discipline. Well, that's something that all of us deal with every single day. Creating habits or breaking bad habits. We deal with that every single day. But there are some that are more common than others. And so that's a big part of it. I would say 3/4 of it. The other quarter of it is what I call either my shower thoughts or my walking thoughts. So I get some of my best inspiration while I'm in the shower or while I'm on a walk. So you were talking about something earlier with a guest just being fed to you and creating what I like to call white space. So we are such an overstimulated society. We are just addicts for stimulation, for dopamine hits every single day, instant gratification. And the one thing that a majority of us are guilty for is creating white space. Think about it through our behaviors. When we go on a walk, what do most of us do? Play music, play a podcast. When we're in the car, driving to the office or going out to eat, what do? Play a podcast, listen to music. We are constantly filling any empty space in our life with some sort of stimulation. And so while this can be a good thing, everything within reason, right? Balance. It also can be a detriment because it means that your authentic thoughts and deep down desires and ideas do not have time to percolate to the surface. And so the two things that I love is complete and utter silence when I'm taking a shower, and going on a walk, complete and utter silence when I'm going on a walk. And that has a very interesting way of thinking, oh, wow, that would be a great idea for an episode. Or, I did an episode on this, but there was 0.5 in there that could have been an episode in itself. And so those are the two ways that I come up with episode subjects.
That is very insightful. I'll say that Andrew Huberman would tell you to make sure that you don't wear sunglasses on your walk because it's very important to get sunlight into your eyes, according to him. So I'll throw that tidbit in there in case you didn't know that.
Interesting. I actually didn't know that.
Yeah. I'm a biomedical engineer. And so I love to listen to podcasts that are educational that I can then take those tools and improve my quality of life. Mm-hmm. And so I was just thinking about one of the things that you said. One of the tools in one of your episodes was an AI journaling app, mm-hmm. Rosebud. Mm-hmm. And the thing I love about it, and I'm trying to think of individuals, there's a lot of research about why, as humans, you mentioned some reasons why humans dislike silence and can be very uncomfortable mm-hmm. with silence for a variety of reasons. And I found for myself, journaling, I know the science and the research behind journaling. Like I know. However, every time I have probably 30 journals I've bought over the years that have maybe 3 pages written in them and then tucked on the shelf.
Good intentions, right? Yeah.
Right, yep. Exactly. And yet one of the things that I like that maybe might be baby steps into using some of that creativity is a tool such as Rosebud. One of the things I like about it is that I can type something and then it can give me back feedback. And I say, yes, that's what I'm thinking. Or no, that's not what I'm thinking. I talk mm-hmm. about it on episode 11 about how it could be useful in mental health space. But I'm thinking about that as far as building up creative ideas for things. And I think I'm going to practice some of that. I used to do Ironman races, and because Ironman races, you're not allowed to use music or anything during the race. And so I would practice, obviously, biking, cycling, and running without music. And mm-hmm. I have solved, in my previous company I built, many of the huge problems or new product ideas all came up during a long run. I mean, I, in fact, made the decision to join my previous company during a long run and all of the reasons of it. So I think that is brilliant. So where do you then... How would you say, so you're balancing, are you still doing the 3 different companies now? And I guess you can share what the 3 different companies are. So, I know from your podcast what some of them are.
One of them is the podcast itself. So now it has a newsletter. We're filing stuff with a course. We have coaching. We do group coaching. We have digital assets that we sell. So mindset worksheet. We have what I've coined the U-Hub. That is one of the companies. The other one is a manufacturing company that we actually manufacture and design cannabis-specific fertilizers, because there are so many health implications with cannabis that are finally coming to light, and the stigma, talk about stigma, is finally being broken. The other one is a platform that is soon to be launched that I've been pouring my heart and soul into. And it is, again, in the cannabis space, but what it does is it takes into account your preferences as a consumer, because we are so unique. And so we coin this your cannabis aura. And so we take unique data points from each of the users by filling out a questionnaire. And that questionnaire is then cross-referenced with a data set that we have of 5,227 cultivars, made up of over 500,000 at 627,000 data points. And we are able to match you with your unique cannabis strain that meets your preferences, whether it be you're trying to solve for some back pain, you have migraines, you're stressed, all of these different things, because there is not a specific product tailored to unique individuals. And so that is the most recent company. So I manage those 2 along with the podcast, the newsletter, the coaching, building the course, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun too.
That's amazing. And listeners, to be super clear, you may wonder, why is Ange fine with talking about cannabis on Recovery Advocate Network? And I am completely fine with it. And part of it, I'll just tag a couple of other resources that I've listened to recently. One is How to Change Your Mind, a phenomenal book. And there is a documentary that you can watch on it. Andrew Huberman does a lot of episodes on the clinical studies for MDMA research. Listeners know that I have severe PTSD from a kidnapping that occurred years ago. And so there are a lot of research trials trying to find different treatment methodologies. And I am a believer, personally, adding that disclaimer in there, am a believer of utilizing a variety of tools or testing a variety of tools to find the tool that is most effective for each individual. The idea that we would be as unique human beings as we are, and there would just be one set of tools that would work for everyone is absolutely ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And so I'm absolutely a proponent of individuals collaborating with their community and therapists and psychiatrists and doctors and advisors and mentors to find the tools that will allow them to live the absolute best life that they can live.
You said a key word there and is open-minded. I think that recognizing any time you go to shut something down, politics is a great example. It's never productive. 99.8% of the time it's not productive because we immediately shut ideas down or we search for further validation why our point is correct. And I think one of the best things that we can do as humans is to be open-minded. I have actually brought on a PhD, a scientist on my podcast specifically to talk about cannabis and how much it can help people. Obviously, everybody is so unique and so different and everything within reason. I quit drinking 2 years ago for very specific reasons. I dropped a whole episode on that. And I have found different outlets in my life to in a healthy way, manage some of the things that I was dealing with. The podcast, we just talked about it. It's not a pill. It's not a cannabis plant, but it is a solution for anxiety. It is a solution to heal some traumas, all of these different things. And so it might not be a physical thing, but also a intangible aspect, whether it be going on a walk or sitting in silence with yourself, right? So I think just being open-minded, because you're right, it's never one thing. That's why I have so many episodes, because there are many things on my podcast that probably don't work for people, but maybe there's one or two that does. And great, then leverage that and keep on working at and focusing on that thing. But you don't know until you try, right? To your point of dropping podcast episodes, the idea is action. Action creates data points. Data points then are brought back and you can make better decisions. But without action, you don't get the data. And without the data, you can't make better decisions. So we need to keep an open mind about everything in life, because who knows what data we have been shut off from receiving. And I think that's such a dangerous way to live.
Without a doubt. I love a comment that you just made, and I wonder if I can find the quote in the book. I'm currently reading the book Craving Recovery by Joshua Young. I'm interviewing him tomorrow, so I have a lot of reading to do. So wish me luck tonight. He talks in here, a word that you said that I want to pinpoint is the solution, or rather a phrase, a solution to a problem. That's exactly it. So much of what we as humans do throughout our day and everything we do are find solutions to problems, some of which are healthy, some of which are not healthy. Mm-hmm. And so in some of the earlier episodes that I've done where we've talked, especially the episode we did, an episode on, I think it is episode 13 or 14, is a link between childhood trauma and addiction. And much of that talks about in early childhood, the solution to surviving trauma was self-harm or was drugs, alcohol, whatever it was. That was our solution at the time. However, it's not a healthy solution. So in order to grow and live the best life is to come up with, and I'm not going to be able to find the quote now. I'll include it in the show notes or in the outro, people. But in order to do that is to find what is a healthy solution. And I believe that it is absolutely impossible to find a solution if you don't find the problem. Mm-hmm. And the problem is one of the things that I think as a society we neglect when we're helping individuals who are struggling with mental health challenges, depression, addiction, all of these. Because I think that the system is set up to treat the solution the individual is using rather than to take a step back and say, well, wait, let's just for a minute forget what their particular solution is. Let's see how we can figure out what the actual problem is. And Joshua talks about it in his book. His problem that he talks about is a sexual trauma that he had as a teen that he turned into an alcoholic over it. And it wasn't until he was able to talk about that problem that he could then start working on appropriate solutions within that. So I love that idea of thinking through, okay, what are the variety of solutions? And I just want to encourage listeners, when you hear this and you're listening to Scott's episodes and you hear these variety of solutions, I just want to encourage you as well to pause and think, what are the challenges that I'm having in my life that I'm looking for a solution for as well?
We not only reverting back a little bit to the overstimulation that we live in this world, we move through life at breakneck speed. Okay. So driving down the highway, think about you're in a car, it's doing 70, 80, wherever you are. The chances that you are going to be able to absorb all of that information traveling at 80 miles per hour or the details is probably very slim. However, if you're driving on a car in a back road where the speed limit's 30 miles per hour, you're probably going to notice a unique set of flowers over on the road or a family of squirrels living in a tree branch that had fallen, right? And so I think it's the same idea with our life too as well. We are so used to moving at breakneck speed that we deal with our emotions the same way. We suppress them. We move past them. We don't actually dive deep into what they actually mean or what they're telling us. When we feel something, we're experiencing something, that's a signal, like a light at an intersection, right? To stop, go. But most of us don't treat our emotions that way. We're like, oh, I don't like that. That's not good. Push that down. Nope, go away. And I'm bringing humor to this because it's important, I think, to really see through to the solution. And I think this is part of what I was saying earlier on creating white space. You actually stop. You pause. You get to breathe for a moment and say, why am I feeling this way? Where do I think this came from? What do I think this is trying to tell me? So I don't know if you've ever heard of EOS, but it stands for Entrepreneurial Operating System. And I have it at all of my companies. There's a really good book called What the Heck is EOS? I think every company in the world should actually run off of EOS. And I think individually we could use it too as well. There is a part of it where the all hands meetings every day are the same exact time with the same exact agenda, with the same exact stamps of time for each section of that agenda. The majority of that meeting, which is 60 minutes of the hour and a half, is what's called IDS, identify, discover, and solve. And I think that's a really important acronym for each of us to remember every single day. IDS, identify, discover, and solve. And the idea of it is to ask the 5 whys. So an example would be you're in manufacturing and a piece of equipment seized up. Well, why did it seize up? Well, it wasn't lubricated properly. Well, why wasn't it lubricated properly? Well, one of the employees on the floor didn't lubricate it last week. Well, why didn't he lubricate it last week? Oh, because Steve was never trained by John, the manager. Ah, got it. So production didn't drop because the machine was broken. Production dropped because we didn't have proper training protocol or process in place. And that's actually why it stopped. It's a very interesting parallel that we can implement in our individual lives on a personal level. I think there's a lot to learn from a great business with great people, with great SOPs that we can establish. And that might sound a little rigid, but it's not. And I think that is a great process for us to start to identify what's happening, discover where's it coming from, and then, to your point, the solution. What is the solution to actually the deep down emotion, trauma, and how do we build a solution around that moving forward and then manage it?
So I've repeatedly said there are a few things that I believe that every individual should learn in middle school. And they are, I'm adding one after what you just said. So historically, what I've said is 1, DBT skills. So dialectical behavioral therapy skills. I think they're freaking amazing. Another is boundaries. I would love if everyone read Cloud & Townsend's book on boundaries. I think it's amazing as well. The third is I do not wish addiction on anyone. However, a lot of the principles in the process of the 12 steps and how it can make you just a better human being is great. And then I think the fourth is the 5 whys, hence coming out of a lot of engineering principles. But the 5 whys, how it can be applied to every part of your life to go from where you think the problem is to what the problem really is. That is amazing. I just had that realization when you were saying that. And I've been a believer of, and listeners, there is a book on the 5 whys. You can go through and you can read the 5 whys. I will put a link in the show notes, and I will also include these acronyms as well as the links that Scott has mentioned in the show notes, as well as links to his podcast. But I love that. So is there anything that you expected to talk about today that we haven't had a chance to mention yet?
We covered some great material. I would just leave everybody with this. We are the most advanced piece of technology on this planet. Our brains are the most advanced computer that we still, scratching the surface, don't understand how to operate it or what it does and how it does certain things. That can be intimidating or that can be empowering. The empowering piece of it is that most of us are guilty for focusing on the things that we cannot control. But I would argue that most everything we can control. We can't control the future or what happens to somebody else, but we can choose the vocabulary that we use. We can choose the environment that we're in. We can start to identify the vocabulary we use. Why do we use I can't, or I'm not good enough, or I don't deserve this? Where did those things come from? How are they implanted? Was it society? Was it school? Was it your upbringing? Was it a friend? Was it a bully? Was it a spouse? We have the ability every single day to be the person that we deserve to be. And when we realize that, and that it's not the government, it's not your family, it's not your upbringing, it's not who you are, it's none of those things. It's all in your head. That can either be a scary thing or an empowering thing. We have the key to our prison, each of us. And all we have to do is pull it out of our pocket and unlock our cell and walk through to the life that we deserve. And I think understanding and realizing that we each have that power is the most freeing thing on this planet and should give you goosebumps and inspiration every day to just get 1% better, to give yourself a little more love, a little more opportunity, a little more grace, a little more compassion. And it will be an endless fuel source for you like you have never imagined. And you will put on a different set of glasses and see the world in a completely different light. And so I just want to leave everybody with that power, that superpower that you have. Think of a superhero. The idea is to float, not to weigh ourselves down, right? It's not to carry extra baggage. Superman or Superwoman, they float. Why do they float? They're so light because they don't have any of this baggage. They're free. And each of us deserves that every single day. And wake up every day and just look in the mirror. The only enemy that we are facing, it's not an entity, it's not a government, it's not a race, it's not an organization. It's just you. It's you, the person you're looking back in the mirror. And to go back to the chapter quote that you referred to in my podcast, you're just outdoing yesterday's chapter. That's it. Nobody else. You are your greatest enemy. And your computer and your coding, your algorithm can be changed. And it's not going to change overnight, but it will be changed if you give yourself the credit, the opportunity, the space to do so.
Wow. Now that is motivating. And at the same point, it is a requirement of this podcast that you provide your favorite motivational quote. Did you remember to bring it?
I did. And it's hard to forget it because I actually wear it around my neck every single day. And it's by a beautiful speech by Theodore Roosevelt in 1910. He actually had this speech at the University of Paris. And it goes, "The credit goes to the man in the arena." And the idea about this quote, and I love it, is that true credit belongs to those who actively engage in challenges and strive for progress. Even if we make a mistake, as big or as small as we think, rather than those to who merely are sitting in the stands, criticizing and pointing. I think of football all the time. It's really easy sitting in the stands, eating some popcorn and drinking a beer to point down at all the players and say, you get paid $2 million a year, catch a damn ball. But I praise, and so did Theodore Roosevelt, that those who dare greatly, even in the face of failure, over those who never take risk. So each day, take that risk, because the only thing that matters is how you think about yourself. Favorite quote.
I'm going to read the whole quote because, listeners, I happen to have it hanging in my office.
That's awesome.
So give me 1 second. And I have, because I am a woman, so I have what's been translated into the woman's version of it. But I'll read it as the man's version. So, the man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly. Thank you so much, Scott. This is amazing.
Thank you.
You just listened to episode number 20. I thoroughly enjoyed my fan club time with Scott and learning from his life experiences. To learn more about Scott, visit his website at www.scottlynch.com. And that's spelled Scott, SCOTTMLYNCH.com. You can follow him on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or X, at Motivated Scott. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host and guest's own personal stories and do not represent the opinions of any organization mentioned. Ryan is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. Coffee and Conversation is proud to announce we are not only a top 30 health podcast in Florida, we now have listeners in the following countries: United States, United Kingdom, Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Canada, France, Japan, Austria, Kenya, Isles of Man, Indonesia, Germany, Czech Republic, India, and Ireland. So if you have friends in countries outside of these, please make sure you hurry up and share the podcast to expand the individuals who can listen to these stories and grow through the healing of them. If you want to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a future guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. We're actually going to start a portion of the series where we read several of those blog posts on the podcast. We also encourage you to comment on the episode so that we can continue to provide content that is most beneficial to the community. And when you do, I'll give you a shout out. In case you're wondering, every individual working with RAND does so on a 100% volunteer basis. All funds raised go to support the mission. So don't forget to love, not like our podcast and subscribe today. I hope you've seen some amazing guests, and I happen to know we have some amazing guests in the future. So make sure you do that subscribe. We are blown away by the reception of this podcast and hence are seeking a volunteer podcast publishing assistant. If you are interested, please email us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. Now, we will hope you will connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read those blog posts, and stay in the loop about upcoming events. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at Rand to Wellness. If this episode was triggering to you, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or If in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you live in a country outside of the U.S. and have information for helpful resources, please email us so that we can provide those to listeners. Reminder, if you wish to provide feedback, leave comments on the episode or email us. And now, thanks for joining, and back to your coffee.